Hello everyone, and welcome to session 2, which is going to be on carceral landscapes. There will be 3 papers in total, and every presenter will have 20 minutes. And I will just literally say very briefly a 2-minute and a 5-minute warning. So you will hear me, but you won't see me. And we will take questions through the Q&A function, so please post away during the papers, and we will try and hear some questions after each paper. Okay, so the first presentation is going to be by Dominique Moran and Jennifer Turner. I think Dom will be presenting on prisons as post-military landscapes, carceral spaces of demobilisation, and military-civilian transition.
So thanks, Anna. I hope you can all hear me. So I'm speaking today on behalf of my co-author, Jennifer Turner, just to keep the technical complications as small as we can enable them to be, but I should say that all mistakes in this presentation are my own. So if I can change slide. So in our paper, what we're going to be doing is drawing together carceral and military geographies, and we think this is interesting because it hasn't really been done in the past. And we're building on our prior theorisation of the prison military complex, which we talked about in a paper that we wrote a couple of years ago with our colleague Helen Arnold. In the paper, we also intend to work with the notion of demobilisation, which I'll come on to in just a bit, and to consider some very preliminary data which we have coming out of a project about the post-military experience of prison staff. So just to begin with then, drawing together carceral and military geographies. Carceral geographies, as many people on this call will know, have over the last few years claimed a whole range of different spaces, kind of as carceral spaces. So the fairly predictable ones, prisons, detention centres and so on, but also a range of different forms of confinement, both within and beyond such formal institutions. However, within this work, consideration of military spaces is relatively rare. So there has been some really interesting work on the use of military island bases for the detention of migrants. But beyond this kind of work, there isn't really the sort of treatment of these spaces that we think that there might be. Military geographies, on the other hand, is primarily concerned with, and I quote, the social and political construction of military activities, militarism and militarization, with reference to the spaces and places within which they are constituted and through which they are expressed. And here there's a whole range of different spaces, such as battlefields, defence, infrastructure, and so on. However, within this work, there's very rarely a focus on military confinement itself. However, within this work, there is a really interesting line of work on what they call post-military landscapes. So these, as Rachel Woodward has defined them, are those without a military function in the present, but where the imprint of a former military function remains too pervasive to enable the erasure of their military origins. And the picture that you see on the right hand side there of Second World War gun emplacements, which of course are not in use now, is an example of this kind of post military area. So the question that we want to ask in our paper then is, could the prison be a post military landscape? And if it is, what might that mean? So if we think of the prison in this way, what we are therefore looking for is this pervasive imprint of a former military function. And there's one really obvious way in which that could happen, which I'm going to talk through in a minute, and then some other perhaps less obvious ways. So the first and the most obvious way is in the actual landscape itself. So here is a picture, an aerial picture from 1946 of RAF, that's the Royal Air Force Base at Coltishall in Norfolk. And perhaps you can see on this slide the large aircraft hangar buildings here and the airfield down here. And I would also draw your attention to these H-shaped blocks, which are arranged on either side of the central parade ground, 4 on one side, 3 on the other. So this is the area in which the staff lived at this base in the Second World War. What is on the site right now is HMP Bure, a prison. And I would again draw your attention to these H-shaped blocks, 4 on one side, 3 on the other. These are the same buildings which were in use as the RAF base in the Second World War and which are still the prison now. At the time that this prison was founded, the governor designate pointed out the very appropriate use, as he saw it, of putting these buildings which had withstood the Luftwaffe in the Second World War. You know, these are good, solid buildings and good for putting prisoners into. That's not the only example, though. There are many of these. This is HMP Lindholm, an RAF base, again, which was used during the Second World War. Apologies for having flipped that Google Earth image around. I've done so that you can see how similar it is to the RAF Coltishall image from the Second World War. Again, you can see those H-shaped blocks, which are of course the same as were there for the RAF. And according to English Heritage, which has surveyed all of these sites, these buildings have been altered only very slightly since the war. They also claim that there's camouflage paint work on them as well. And of course, this isn't the only example. This is HMS. This is a kind of land base for the Navy, which became HMP YOI Weatherby. And again, you see some historic pictures here of the HMS base as it was during the Second World War and as it is now. And as you can see, the fabric is fairly similar. But it's not just about the elements of the landscape. This prison is the only one in the UK which has an army cadet force based in it. So there's some other kind of connection essentially going on between the military heritage of this area and the prison as it stands now. And that's exactly what we were interested in this paper, in which we called the prison military complex. We use this term for the deep-rooted, long-standing, widespread and diverse connections between prisons and the military. And we pointed in that paper to exactly this kind of thing. So the conversion of military bases into prisons, and of course this goes vice versa as well. Leadership of prisons and prison services by ex-military personnel, and all sorts of other things, including, for example, the incarceration of former military personnel. And particularly in that paper and in the rest of this one, we focused on ex-military personnel who are employed as prison officers. And this, we thought, was something that's very widely observed. So I'm sure that anybody who's ever interviewed prison staff will have met those staff who have had a military background. So this is something that we had all come across in our work previously, but which we felt would have benefited from further research and further investigation. And that's because there's really widespread generalizations about the characteristics of ex-military personnel and whether they are suitable or not for prison work in this way. However, they have been targeted for recruitment to the prison service widely, and especially in the UK, based on an assumed ability that they can deliver discipline. And this is something that in that sort of policy discourse prisons have been felt to lack. And in some other papers which we have in review just now, we've been exploring the lack of data about how many ex-military personnel there are within the prison service and trying to come up with some data of our own. And we estimate that between 1 and 3/4 of prison personnel in the UK have had military experience since the 1960s. This is a really large number of people. And for us, this raises all sorts of questions about their experience. So whether they can ever be properly demobilised from military duty in the prison service, what their presence within the prison means for how the prison operates, and for the purposes of this paper, this question about whether the presence of ex-military personnel in their own post-military life stages makes the prison into a post-military landscape. So this demobilisation, this term that we have in the title of the paper, essentially means the end of military service, and it marks the beginning of the military civilian transition, this movement from military into civilian life. And this can be really challenging to overcome. So there's reams of work been done on exactly what these challenges are. So some people encountering this military civilian transition struggle with mental health problems, with PTSD and so on, which are thought to contribute to homelessness, to criminal activity, and then to incarceration. And this is the group of veterans in custody that we have all, I'm sure, have heard of. A lot of other people leaving military service cope really quite well. They don't experience these kind of challenges, but they still do experience a sort of liminal or in-between identity and feel a bit lost or abandoned without what they would have described as the camaraderie of military life. And in order to overcome this, it is argued, many seek familiar environments. So they take jobs in uniformed hierarchical organisations that are in some way connected to safety, security and so on. And the prison service, of course, is one of those. So the question then is whether this demobilisation, in terms of its military understanding, makes mobile a post-military or military identity, and what implications that carries for the prison itself. And in terms of the theme of this conference, we feel that this links really well to wider debates over carceral mobility itself, and the prison as a site of mobility and mobilisation, both in terms of space and in terms of personality and identity. So this demobilisation then of military personnel brings them into contact with, brings their military experience into the prison, and has been doing so for some time. It also brings them, if we consider this word of demobilisation as immobilisation, which it doesn't mean, but if it did, it brings these different groups of people into the prison and into contact with one another at the same time. And this is all happening at the same time that ex-military staff are transitioning from military to civilian lives themselves, albeit in a very familiar environment to them as ex-military personnel. And they're trying at the same time to assist incarcerated persons in being rehabilitated for life after prison. So if we think of this as a diagram, we've got ex-military personnel and civilians entering the prison, which contains military staff. It might be built into converted military buildings. It may have ex-military senior management. It might have all kinds of other connotations of the military itself. So what kind of environment is this, and who comes out of the other side of it? In order to answer some of these questions, we conducted two surveys, and I won't speak in depth about this because there's time at the end. But essentially, these were open to current and former UK prison officers, both with and without military service. And I'm drawing from these in the quotes which come. So we were asking some questions about the extent to which ex-military personnel bring their military experience to the prison, and the extent to which their so-called military characteristics, if we can say what these are valued. So there were some really stereotypical views about discipline, physical prowess and so on. So ex-military staff being punctual, smart, no nonsense and so on, shading into notions of being inflexible, which is one of the criticisms which have been levelled against them in the past. And, you know, you can see on that quote on the slides some of those key words there, but there were also other qualities as well which we might not have anticipated. So for example, this ability to show compassion to prisoners at the time of bereavement, and to appreciate the importance of taking an active part in funerals that perhaps wouldn't have been at the top of our list of a stereotypical sort of list of military skills. For some people entering the prison, there was a sense in which they felt that it wasn't military enough. that they were disappointed that more military types of behaviour weren't common within the prison service. Other people stressed that military experience could be used in the prison, but it needed to be adapted to prison work, and that depended on the individual's capability and inclination to do so. And of course, people vary, right? Not everyone's going to do this in the same way. Some people are overtly seeking to maintain a sense of the military in their own working life and in the prison itself. So this person saying some ex-military staff are keen to run the jail like a military camp, while others don't want to talk about their time in Her Majesty's forces. And also some really interesting reflections on the nature of military experience as life experience. So here's a quote from a man in his 50s who has a military background, and he says, "We're recruiting some very young staff with no life experience. They therefore do not have the confidence to challenge or even encourage prisoners as they should be doing. The camaraderie one experiences in the forces helps to cope with the way prisoners can sometimes try to take the piss or push the boundaries. Ex-forces people usually deal with this with humour, but have the confidence to let prisoners know that they shouldn't do it, and so respect is built." So reflecting on this and also thinking about the literature, the extensive work which has already been undertaken on the nature of military civilian transition, this raised some really interesting questions for us about what prison officers' military life experience is good for in the prison context, because some of the things that we know that prisoners experience, so institutionalization, infantilization, for example, getting accustomed to not making decisions about how they live their lives on a sort of everyday basis, is also the experience of ex-military personnel leaving the military. They also feel sort of, thank you, unused to exercising agency in this way. So there's some really interesting questions, I think, to be further pursued about whether or not ex-military prison officers' experience is most useful in supporting incarcerated people whilst they're managing life in prison. So in other words, managing life in that institution, rather than necessarily in preparing them for the life that they will lead after release. So there's some really interesting sort of interactions between leaving one institution, moving into another one, and the transferability, I suppose, of that experience. What can be learned by one from the other? So in conclusion then, I'm sure you can see that we have as many unanswered questions as we have answers here, and in a way that's quite good because we're at the very start of a broader research programme. So Jennifer and I conducted this research in the UK, but we're really pleased now that to be able to collaborate further with Rose Ricciardelli and Anna Eriksson in some work further continuing this investigation in Canada through the with support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and we're also hoping to be able to continue this research project into Australia as well, and look at some comparisons in between these different contexts, which as members of the Commonwealth share some similarities both in their justice systems and also in the armed forces. We think, though, that on balance, this notion of the prison military complex highlights the intersections between the prison and the military, and maybe prisons are more military in many ways than we have been accustomed to thinking, including, but of course not only through the material landscape, the actual buildings in which the prison is housed. So there's some questions about the nature of this demobilisation of ex-military personnel into the prison service. Does it, through bringing them into another institution, uniformed, hierarchical, and of course full of other ex-military staff, does it actually immobilise their own personal transitions to civilian life? And we come back to a question which, you know, is always posed to us, and we're continually reflecting on it ourselves. This question, you know, was Foucault right when he said that prisons resemble factories, schools, barracks and hospitals, which all resemble prisons? I think there's a lot more to be done in understanding the connections between prisons and the military. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was a very interesting paper, and I think what really comes out is this discussion on institutional life and what that does to staff as well as prisoners in that case, and the transferability that happens. And also I thought it was really interesting to hear about the delivering of discipline and what that means for the prison complex. There have been a couple of questions, so I'll start with the first one. I'll just kind of read it out. Doesn't the parallel between the military sector and the prison sector rely on a very traditional representation of what prison is and should be? What about a more modern model of prison within which everyone is demanded to manage his or her own trajectory based on his or her needs and projects?
That's a really interesting question. So I'm not sure that through the project that we've been undertaking we have the answer to that, but we do have a sort of mirrored answer, if you like, which is about what we understand the military to be, which I think is just as valid a kind of reflection, in that we encountered a lot of stereotypical writing about what the military is, and particularly in the work which has been done up to now, in which sort of comments have been made not particularly based on extensive empirical work about what ex-military personnel, who they are, what they are like, and so on, and by extension a notion of what the military is considered to be. And that didn't really resonate with a lot of the respondents to our survey, who were particularly people who'd served in the military recently and who'd held very senior positions. They were quite keen to say, you know, the military is not all about violence. It's not all about sort of unthinking brutality. The prison actually is about those things. The military isn't, and the prison would be much better if it was more like what they considered the modern military to be, a more compassionate collective endeavour. Now, you know, I don't have military experience. We haven't conducted extensive research in that area, but there seems to be a lot more understanding to be gained about what the military actually is like, what its characteristics are, and the extent to which those are being brought into the prison, and how we would recognise the influence of the military in there, given that it is an awful lot more than violence, discipline, and sort of keeping, restraining, and kind of keeping order. So I think one of the reflections that we have from really quite early on in this project is that there's a lot further definitional work that needs to be done in understanding what these two things are. And of course, as the question poses it, that's just as valid a question about the prison as it is about the military. I don't know, Jen, if you want to chime in, please do.
Thank you very much. So there were a few questions here about the kind of connection between the military and military personnel and their kind of relation to the wider carceral estate. So not just prisons and I guess detention centres, but also other security businesses, for example. And how there's a connection of the military going into other security areas. Can you say a little bit about that? Has that come up at all? That maybe prison staff have also previously worked in other types of security?
Jen, do you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for that interesting question. Taking the data from the survey, sorry, I've got terrible feedback. I'll carry on. Taking the data from the survey, we actually asked former military prison staff to think about different rationales for entering the prison service, and actually we found that only a small portion of former military prison staff had actually intended to apply for the prison service as their first choice employer. More generally, respondents indicated that they had intended to join the police service, or indeed other of those peripheral kind of prison-like or carceral-like organisations such as security services or the fire or other uniformed services such as the fire service. So actually, I think there is a really interesting set of work to consider in relation to the kind of the link between the wider prison military complex and other perhaps carceral spaces in that respect. So again, I can't give you any definitive answers in relation to that, but all we do know is that the prison is one amongst many other very similar carceral or security-like businesses to which this group of prison staff are interested in applying or experiencing.
Thank you. I guess another question that's come up a few times here is how you see the kind of encounter, or are there any examples of how ex-military staff interact with ex-military prisoners? I think that's also come up in our own research. We've interviewed a few people in mainstream prisons who came from the military and were actually sent there by military courts. So there's a whole separate justice system, I guess, that exists in the UK. I don't know about other countries, where the usual justice system doesn't really apply, but people are still sent to kind of mainstream prisons. I don't know if you can say a bit more about the interaction there that happens.
Yeah, shall I start, Jen, and then I'll hand over to you. Yeah, so there's some similarity there in that there's a military prison for the UK armed forces, so frequently military personnel who've offended against military rules would be sent there, or they would be sent to a mainstream prison if they've offended against the laws that apply to them and to everybody else. And the question about interaction or the encounters between ex-military staff and ex-military incarcerated people, that's really interesting. So our research project, through a number of examples of kind of how that operates, or at least some sense on the part of the staff of how they felt about dealing with incarcerated people who also had a military background, and to some extent there's a sense of a shared experience and kind of a brotherhood. This term hasn't come out in our work, but it's one which is used to describe this kind of relationship elsewhere. For some people there's a sense of pity for ex-military incarcerated people that they haven't managed to deal with, leaving the military perhaps as well as the staff feel that they have done. There's also a degree of deployment of a shared military background in order to try to support incarcerated people, occasionally resorting to military terminology. So following on Eleanor's paper earlier, kind of a different kind of jargon being brought into the prison for a particular purpose. Jen, do you want to continue? I don't want to hog the Q&A, so carry on.
I only really wanted to say briefly that actually it is a really interesting question. From the predominantly quantitative responses that we had from these surveys, only 10%, roughly speaking, of the respondents had actually declared that they had worked in a specific, for example, veterans in custody unit. So even at that stage of the research, it's very difficult for us to separate out the prisoner groups. So only a small number of these officers had actually worked with dedicated veterans in custody units. So something definitely to consider and to see play out in terms of future research.
Thank you so much. There's time for one more quick question, and it's been mentioned by a few people in the Q&A how the kind of social invisibility also applies to not just to prisoners and prisons, but also to military staff. And I guess there's a kind of methodological question here of how did you find that in your research practice that it was difficult reaching respondents, and did that kind of invisibility of people kind of transfer to how you can engage with them?
Jen, do you want to answer that in terms of the method?
Yeah, I can speak about the methods. In general, this was a kind of two-tailed sample where we had approached current and former staff in 6 dedicated current prisons, but also former prison staff more widely. We generally had a strong response from the institutions that we approached in terms of a typical response rate for this type of survey, but the response rate for former military staff was very high. The majority of respondents declared themselves as having a military background. Now, we can't extrapolate that to talk about that being a representative percentage of prison staff across England and Wales, because the response rate is too small. But what that seems to say to us is that former military staff, prison staff, are interested to talk about their experiences. They think the link here is really valid and important, and that there are ongoing questions about how they perform their role within the prison service. So, 60% of the people we spoke to wanted to tell us about their experiences in the military. So I think it's again really important and rationalises the ongoing work that we are doing.
That's really interesting. And just to say that there are a few more questions that maybe you want to respond to later in the chat room, or just if people want to contact you directly there, please